poetry in the 18th century and the 17th century as well enjoyed far, far more prominence than it does now. A lot of people read poetry. It was very, very important. And there were all, poetry was read for pleasure, but it was also seen as being educational. So there were a lot of poems, for example, about Newton's optics, about Newton's gravity. Round about the time the Botanic Garden came out, there was a long poem by someone who'd been in a shipwreck. And the author used that poem to explain all the terminology of ships and compasses and navigational instruments. So this idea of having a long poem with explanatory didactic footnotes was by no means unique to Darwin. It was quite an accepted genre of the time.
So the poetry, I think the poetry is very different. It's very difficult to come to the poetry, you know, from the contemporary standpoint. I mean, I'm a scholar of 18th century literature, so I'm more familiar with the different kind of mode and model of poetry in the 18th century, and it really was very different. We're talking about kind of pre-romantic literature here. It's very controlled, it's very kind of staged. I think it's a poetry of wit. It enjoys making jokes, it enjoys the kind of the kind of polish of the ideas and the language coming together. So it's something that you have to tune into, I think, and take it on its own terms.
It's 18th century verse par excellence. It uses the heroic couplet as perfected by Pope. It's artificial, it revels in its poetic diction. But the other simple, straightforward term for it is didactic poetry. Darwin has no shame about that word. It's not seen as a bad thing. There was a long tradition of didactic poetry going back to Greek and Roman poets. Possibly his greatest model was Lucretius, the great Latin poet who talked about science in verse that was generally reckoned as fantastic. Huge influence on Virgil and so forth. So yes, he unashamedly wrote Enlightenment didactic poetry.
A description of Darwin's poetry, I would refer back to Pope actually. I think it's about the rhyming couplet. It's about witticism. Darwin describes his poetry as in many ways it's quite a feminine sort of poetry. The comparisons he looks for are domestic and feminine. He says he calls himself a flower painter. He says my poetry is like the pictures you might see hanging up on a lady's dressing room wall, connected with ribbon. So it's a very sort of feminine, leisured, domestic, light sort of model that he's offering for himself. But I think that is in a kind of dialogue with the real heft of knowledge and the kind of weightiness of the questions and the material that he's dealing with. I mean, I think he's attempting to lighten something and make it accessible whilst actually delivering something which, you know, it's got a real philosophical import. So it may be that's why he says he wants to enlist imagination under the banner of science. So these two terms, imagination and science, you know, the kind of light and pleasurable and the kind of harder and weightier.
Darwin wrote his poem for mainly for women, but also for men, and he wrote it explicitly to educate. He was experimenting. He was trying to fuse together scientific education right inside a poem, and he was a bit worried about that. He was a bit worried about his own reputation as a scientific expert. He didn't want to see his scientific status being sullied by moving into poetry. So he was a bit tentative in when he first wrote The Loves of the Plants. But the book sold extremely well, which must have been very encouraging. It was also criticised, but it sold well, and that's quite important.
So Darwin, when the Botanic Garden appeared, it was reviewed very positively across the periodical press. This is a review of The Loves of the Plants, which appeared in 1789 by William Cowper, who was a prominent poet, Jane Austen's favourite poet. And I think it tells you something about the terms in which this poem was received and the particular poetic aesthetic that it was seen to offer. So Cowper says, the poetry itself is of a very superior cast, and whether we consider the author's management of his subject, his delicacy of expression, or the sweetness of his numbers, we feel ourselves equally called upon to commend him. He introduces his various objects of description with so much versatility of genius that we could not but admire the grace and ease and the playfulness of fancy with which he conducts himself through this part of his business, perhaps the most difficult of all. His descriptions themselves are luminous as language selected with the finest taste can make them, and meet the eye with the boldness of projection unattainable by any hand but that of a master.
I think it was very original. Having footnotes, having substantial footnotes to a verse poem wasn't unprecedented. Didactic poems had done this before. Quite often it might well be that they would describe some scientific phenomenon, perhaps a flower or something like that, and then the note would tell you a bit more about it. What Darwin is doing in, first of all, perhaps to take the loves of the plants, which is the most botanical part of the Botanic Garden, and which is the first poem he published. The verse and the prose are contrapuntal. They work in a completely different way from each other. The verse gives a just about identifiable description of the plant, often focusing on the flower, but a great deal of what it says is about the specific arrangement of the stamens and pistils in terms of, well, how does that class them in terms of the taxonomy of Linnaeus? But he then goes off into these extraordinary love affairs of these 5 youths who are kind of all enamoured of this chaste beauty, and he will compare them to mythical figures or literary figures like Othello or Peter Abelard at one point. He will really range over the world of non-scientific culture to fill out these strange kind of conceits he's got, that the pistils and stamens are little human beings in love with each other. And all that is done on the level of the poetry. And then when you go to the note, it's pretty rigidly scientific. There's actually nothing said about, or very little said indeed, about the mythological, literary, etc. references. You go straight to the science, and then if you read it carefully enough, you can quite often see, oh, that's why that plant is like Othello or Eloisa or something like that. You've got to work it out for yourself. So there's this strange sort of interplay between the verse and the notes, which depends on the extreme artificiality of his metaphors and conceits in the verse. So I would say in that way he is highly, highly original.
I think it was in many ways. Interestingly, he took the notes for the Botanic Garden from a woman writer, somebody called Anna Seward, who was very closely affiliated with the Lichfield Society, Lichfield Botanical Society. And she'd been making notes on Darwin's Botanic Garden at Lichfield, which was arranged along the Linnaean classification. And originally he wanted her to write the verse, and he was going to write the notes. But she actually turned this down because she thought, I think she used the word, impropriety there again. It wasn't appropriate for the female sex to undertake such a project. So in fact, he ended up writing poetry in some ways. So it had a very interesting development as a poem, and there was quite a lot of other input into it as well from other, I suppose, sources.
He has an enormous fan in the scientist Thomas Beddoes, who went off to do all kinds of experiments with gases in Bristol, along with Coleridge and Southey and Humphrey Davy and so on. Coleridge personally gravitated into his orbit. Wordsworth's early poetry, like descriptive sketches, is very much modelled on his style, but more specifically copying him as a didactic poet and perhaps particularly as a botanical poet, there are poets like Arabella Rowden and Charlotte Smith who also personify their plants, aspects of their plants. Neither of them goes as sort of as firmly into the sexual dimension as Darwin. Neither of them are quite so fixated on the loves of the stamens for the pistils. They find more soft-peddling ways of presenting the botany, but they are very, very clearly influenced by what he's doing.
Okay, so this is one of the things that Darwin says at the beginning of the Botanic Garden. He says that his aim is to enlist imagination under the banner of science. So we can ask, what does this mean? And the Botanic Garden he calls a poem with philosophical notes. So he's trying to combine these two things. He's trying to combine poetry with philosophy. So it seems to me that he's trying to use imagination as a means to enable a kind of wide readership to begin to approach some topics and questions, you know, which are normally on the kind of area of philosophy, but approaching them through imagination and through the literary genre of a poem. These become more accessible to a readership, and perhaps also more accessible to a female readership, because botany was an acceptable kind of topic for young ladies to study. So what can poetry give Darwin, and what can poetry do in order to sort of progress scientific thought and speculation? I mean, this is something that Darwin himself addresses in the Botanic Garden, because as well as the poem, we have the interludes where he's reflecting on his own poetic method, and the interludes are dialogues that are staged between the poet and the bookseller. And one of these interludes reflects on reverie. And this is really very interesting, because Darwin is offering a theory of what his poetry is, and, if you like, a theory of mind as well, and it connects with the way he thinks about how the mind works and how ideas are produced in the mind, and especially how poetry enables a particular reflection on ideas. So Darwin says that what goes on in poetry is, because poetry is under the rule of imagination, imagination enables a kind of pleasurable suspension to take place in the mind, and he calls it a reverie. And in this reverie, a train of ideas are sort of, they process across the mind, and the mind is kind of suspended in a kind of state of contemplation, and it's able to review these ideas and perhaps think about the connections between them, and it's a very powerful mental faculty for Darwin. I think that gives us a sense of the seriousness of what his project is in Botanic Garden, a serious kind of project which he isn't entirely overt about, because he presents it as this frivolous kind of feminine poem, but clearly, if you take him at his word, he's suggesting that what his poem can do is suspend the reader in a state of imaginative pleasure, a kind of poetic reverie, whilst reviewing these fully fledged, actually, scientific ideas and speculations and theories about animated life. So that is the promise, I think, of what the Botanic Garden can do for its reader.